You're listening to Generation AI
from Live Person.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Generation AI. I'm Joe Bradley, joined by Ruth Zive, and it's a pleasure for us to be speaking today with Ron Miller.
Nice to be here.
Ron, welcome. Ron's a reporter for TechCrunch. He covers the enterprise technology beat, and amongst many other things, AI in the enterprise.
Yeah, and that's been a pretty big topic this year, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine. I'd love to just dive right in. I think you have a bird's eye view on a lot that our listeners are going to be very interested to hear about. So you've written a whole article on this, Ron, but I think maybe a great place to start would be around this question of AI as a market or as a platform. And maybe to get that going, tell us a little bit about what you mean when you talk about market and when you talk about platform, and then how AI fits into that.
So, I was thinking about this before the podcast, and I think a good analogy for this is the cloud, right? So the cloud infrastructure market is kind of a good analogy for AI. So you have the people who are making the foundation models, which may be some of the same players, but there tend to be larger incumbents, and companies don't have to start their own cloud companies because they go and they buy things from these cloud infrastructure vendors. And similarly, you have the foundation model builders, and we have some which are from the large players, the usual suspects, and we have some from newer players like OpenAI and Anthropic and so forth. And if you sort of think about that's the kind of platform that most people plug into, right? And people are going to be plugging in to other people's large language models because it's not going to make a lot of sense for most companies to try and build their own. They don't have the resources, they don't have the data, and it's just going to be too expensive and too time consuming. So that's kind of one way to think about a platform. That the market, of course, is just like a software market. Like we think like enterprise companies sell CRM, they sell, ERP, they sell all kinds of, software that, companies consume, and that's how they make their money. And the question I explored was, is this going to be something that's more, the former or the latter? And I guess I have to say, with a bit of a cop-out, it's both. But if I had to choose one, I'd say it's probably more platform. And I'll say that because AI is going to be part of everything going forward. And we've seen that this year. We've seen every enterprise software vendor that I can think of, announcing that they're going to be adding generative AI capabilities to their platforms. So, whoever it is, Salesforce, Workday, Box, Dropbox, everybody is kind of thinking about this and, adding, or at least announcing that they're adding the capabilities, right? Whether those things are ready yet or not. This is all happening very quickly. But I think you're going to start to see, in the years ahead, maybe in the months, the way things are moving, that you're going to start to see more and more, generative AI plugged into just about every piece of software that you see out there.
That's a really good framing. I think Joe and I would both buy into that, and would agree that while it's going to be a bit of both, platform is probably where we're going to see this come to life practically. But what I want to understand, I sit in marketing. I'm very mindful of the fact that there has been an extraordinary amount of hype around generative AI. And I'd love to hear from your perspective. Is the world settling back down to earth? Is the hype going away? You suggested that perhaps this is like a table stakes proposition. Like, where's your thinking around this today, almost a year after all of this kind of burst onto the scene?
Yeah, well, we're starting, there is a tremendous amount of hype, and I think there's still a lot, and it's going to take a while for it to settle down. But obviously, the reason for that hype was the release of ChatGPT, which is just about, as you said, a year ago. And, if you think about AI has existed for decades, really, and, sort of more practically in enterprise software for at least a decade. So if you think about that, when you use something like Salesforce before, and you looked at, okay, I want to know the customers most likely to churn, or I want to know the customers most likely to buy. And you generate a report and you click a button and it would create a report, and you wouldn't really know that AI was the magic behind that report. You would just know that you wanted a report, it gave you the information, and it was more in the background. And when you looked at the startup world, there was a lot of nuts and bolts stuff around machine learning and data science and just very down in the weeds kinds of things that your average user didn't think about and frankly doesn't care about, right? But then ChatGPT comes along and it's something you can see, and it's really almost magical, right? I mean, you can ask it a question, it gives you an answer. You can describe a picture and it makes the picture. You can say, I need this, transformed into SQL, and it does it. I mean, that's pretty amazing, and it is amazing. And so that's why we're kind of at this high level hype right now, because people are just really excited about what they're seeing. But, and maybe we can get into this a little bit, but there's downsides to this too. There's IP questions, intellectual property. There's the hallucination problem. There's the inherent bias problem in AI, among other things. And we're kind of rushing into this, and we have to kind of start, I think, from an enterprise perspective, even though companies are very excited about this, the data sort of shows, yes, they're excited, but yes, they're cautious at the same time. And I think they're somewhat cautious because of, those kinds of downside issues that their legal departments and their compliance people are going to start to question pretty heavily.
For sure. We certainly see that at LivePerson. And we know that recently the Biden administration issued an executive order to set standards around AI safety and security. So just talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about regulation and restrictions. Is that a net positive? Is it going to stifle innovation? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it could be both. It depends how it happens. And I mean, it's interesting that this week, as we're having this discussion, we had the executive order issued. We have that conference on AI safety going on at Bletchley Park in the UK. So there's like two major things that are happening from, a kind of regulatory perspective. How do we regulate this thing that we don't know that much about, and that's moving very quickly? And how do you get in front of it? And again, how do you regulate it in a way that you don't stifle innovation, but that you don't, let something that's unsafe into the public sphere? So it's a very tough thing for regulators and for the government to be dealing with. And we know from experience that the government doesn't necessarily do a good job when it comes to understanding technology and, how to regulate it. We're only starting to see, governments trying to regulate Google now and Facebook now, years after they were dominant. And so, this is something that's like happening in front of us. And, it took 15 years for them to deal with Google and Facebook, and they want to do it, in 10 months. And it's very difficult to do. That's one thing. The other thing is that from a company perspective, if you're creating this technology and you have all of these different governments and regulators coming up with their different ideas of what this should look like, it's going to be very difficult from a production perspective, even though I'm not saying that they shouldn't be regulated. I'm just saying they should be carefully regulated. And that's a hard line for any government or regulatory body to walk. And it's hard for the companies that have to deal with this kind of myriad set of regulations to know where they're going to be going in a thing that's moving very quickly, and how they're going to have to create something that meets those regulations when everything is sort of happening, kind of all at once, willy-nilly. So it's a really tough problem. And then, you have the problem or the issue of, a lot of this is being written by some of the biggest players, or they're invited to the table to help write these regulations. And if they're being invited to write these regulations, are they going to write regulations in a way that are fair to the market as a whole, or that, that benefit them maybe even in subtle ways and discourage, smaller startups from being part of this. So because of the regulatory kind of burden that will come with it. So, a lot to think about. And, these things are just happening in real time.
Yeah, it's sort of unclear who benefits in the end. And then there's also the consideration of like, what about global standards? We've got, different countries taking this on in different ways. Do we get to a place where there are standards globally across the board? I think you're spot on. A lot still to understand and discover.
And one other thing is, when you talk about the global idea, is that there's this kind of competitive aspect, nationally. Like people sort of see AI as kind of a competitive advantage on a country level.
It's like a race almost. It's like,
So if you see it that way, like how do you get together as a group and say, well, we're competing against each other if that's indeed what's happening? And we want to sort of have this universal body of regulation that will help kind of control this. It's very difficult.
Well, yeah, and I think that goes to your point as well about the interests in the room, right? Because a lot of the large corporate interests in AI, tend to be transnational. That you want to open up as many markets as you can. So there's, I think, a really interesting competitive dynamic there in regulation building, along with knowledge asymmetry that you mentioned as well. One of the things that's, I think, a little bit fascinating here to go back and connect this conversation to what you said before about the markets and the platforms is there's this sort of there's a couple of models now for what the AI platform might look like. There's kind of the big one in the ChatGPT space, right, where you go and you call this third party system and it runs completions for you or does whatever it does. But then there's also the sort of the meta pervade model, right, where there's an actual model out there that you can go and get and train on your own. How do you see those dynamics evolving today?
I mean, that's super interesting, because you have, Meta calls Llama open, and it's not exactly open, but it's open-ish. And so, one of the things that I think that if you had a truly open model where researchers could kind of look at the data sets, and it's sort of part of the problem. And one of the reasons years ago, people tried to create OpenStack for the cloud, again, to bring the analogy back to the cloud. The companies that control the cloud market are black boxes, and people like researchers who want to understand how these systems work, they can't necessarily understand at a very minute level how they work. And so I think we face a similar kind of challenge with AI, and an even more kind of critical one, that if you have these models that are, that you can't understand what's happening inside the model, what data was used to create the model, and all of the factors that they added into it, it makes it hard to regulate. It makes it hard to understand as a customer. And I think that, if you have more open models, the open source model, you have a better chance of at least having some level of understanding of the model, even if you don't understand everything, because like Llama does not make the data set, available to people. So I kind of fall on the side of open is better than closed. But there are people who feel like open could lead to more, problems and more issues. So it's a very complicated kind of challenge to address.
I think you're right. I think the other thing, the sort of like copyleft notion or aspect of Llama as well, right? That as you train that model, you're only allowed to train, subsequent Llama models, right? You can't take outputs from that model and go train a different one. And there's a lot of this, like the lineage of data and model training, how companies can use that I think plays into the calculus of whether or not this system will have an ROI for you. Are you seeing any trends in the enterprise around different types of companies that are gravitating towards deeper model training versus using off the shelf stuff? Like what kinds of stuff are you seeing out there as far as the way enterprises are engaging?
I think it depends on the companies. From what I've been seeing, there are a bunch of, smaller public companies that are tending to plug into like the OpenAI API and doing it that way. Um, and then you have other companies that, say like a Salesforce, which is both building its own large language model and allowing customers to kind of have a lot of flexibility in terms of how they use their data. Some are going to be able to plug in, external models. Some will take advantage of what Salesforce is offering. So, the larger the company, obviously, the more options they can offer. But there's companies who are plugging into a single model. There's companies who are trying to keep their options open and, not kind of committing to any particular model because it is a moving target. And, and there are very few companies, I think, that are just kind of putting their own model out there because it's just so expensive. And we're still pretty early.
Yeah. So jury's out on a lot of this in terms of what best in
I
class or
think
best
so.
practice looks like. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that a lot of companies quite intelligently actually are kind of keeping their options open, both for themselves and for their customers, because they don't know what's going to come along and they don't want to kind of be tied to one vendor. And then their customers are in the same situation. They don't know what's going to be happening down the road. And they want to be able to keep that flexibility.
Right. So zooming out a little bit, you've got a broad view of the market. What are you at this moment in time most excited about? And flip side, what are you most fearful of?
Well, I mean, I think, as anybody who covers technology and is excited about technology, I mean, this is pretty cool technology, right? I mean, the fact that it can do what it can do with all of its limitations that we've discussed, it's still an amazing, amazing technology. You just have to understand that as you use it, that it is, it does have some limitations as you use it. And, I think we as humans have to watch it. I mean, if you can't be excited about that, I don't know why you're in this business. But like there are all of these downside risks are what would quote keep me up at night if I were running a company. And as a writer, obviously we're seeing companies already say, oh, we can just use this. What do we even need a human
So
for?
do you actually, I mean, listen, I work in marketing. I have the same thoughts. Do you worry that one day this will put writers out of a job? Do you think that's actually going to happen?
I mean, I think that it depends on how companies view this, right? There's a number of ways to look at this, but as a journalist, I go out in the world and I kind of generate ideas and I talk to people and I go to conferences and I write things. It's not like just taking stuff that exists and writing derivative material based on what I find on the internet. And that's essentially what a chat GPT type of technology does. It takes some existing content, source content, and it creates some sort of derivative of that. And, how long you can do that without having humans create more original content, without having like this really watered down derivative content, I don't know. But from my perspective, I do things that a bot just simply can't do, right? That hasn't stopped some companies from, putting bots, firing people or laying people off and using bots. So even though I know as a journalist with, 25 years experience that, there are things that I can do that bot could never do. It doesn't mean that people who aren't concerned with a bottom line kind of view of the world and are not as concerned about quality work might not just say, well, it's good enough if it's good enough. So that's sort of what worries me the most as a writer from my own perspective and from, certainly the generation that's coming up.
Yeah, and it feels like this is another step in a long line that began for journalism, going back to content aggregation and the early internet. That I would share your concern. I think but I think it suffers from the same limitations that maybe we had in the about.com era, where just there's you kind of got to have a person and a world model around to help frame this stuff. Otherwise, it does kind of seem to get watered down over time.
And there are issues. So I don't know if you both saw yesterday, the Guardian got quite upset with Microsoft because in their portal, they had a story about a woman who had died, and they put a poll next to it asking, how do you think she died? And, and it was a really bad look, like, did she die by accident? Did she die by suicide or by natural causes? I think were the choices. And that's just terrible. And that's a bot looking at a story with no human feeling or emotion, with no understanding of the subtleties of how people think or what that looks like, and just producing, well, it's a story. I'll just do a poll about a story. But it's a terrible, terrible, terrible look. And, that's just one small kind of, mistake, I guess you could call it, that AI makes. And it's just sort of speaks to the idea that we need humans looking at this stuff, and we need humans involved, that you can't kind of sort of give this all over to a bot and expect that, you're not going to have things like that happening, because they don't understand the subtlety of being human or emotion, or, what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that reading the internet would lead one to the best of the ethics of humanity. It's maybe another way to say it.
Right. And when you consider that, the OpenAI model was like trained on Reddit,
Right. There's a lot to unpack there. Unfortunately, we're out of time to unpack it. And let's end on a slightly lighter note than that last one. It's a sort of a fun question we try to ask everybody before they go. In your life, Ron, what is something you really would love to automate, and what is something that you would never want to automate?
Well, I never want to automate my job.
Fair enough.
But that's very kind of egocentric. But geez, it's hard to say. Maybe airplanes. I don't know. I would think that at least you would need a human in the cockpit, right? Again, keeping humans in the loop, for a lot of automated tasks, until we are really, really sure that, these machines are capable of doing these things without, with a full understanding. I mean, if you just look at kind of like some of the mistakes that have been made by fully automated systems, then you know that, there's certainly one of the things that excites me about, this generative AI is the ability to kind of combine code and workflows, and to be able to, and I know that's still kind of a work in progress, but if you can kind of automate some things that are happening on the fly, and certainly from a marketing perspective, Ruth, you could see like creating, a customized web page, for instance, suited particularly for how a person is, what about them. It really would bring customer experience to a kind of, level that we've kind of been hearing about for a number of years, but just haven't been able to achieve because it's really hard to do. And I guess I would just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's certainly a problem deep on our minds. And I think I would agree, a really hard AI problem that a lot of people don't necessarily see as hard from the outside. Listen, we're out of time for today, Ron, but thanks so much for joining us and being here with us today. Love the conversation, and we'll keep eagerly reading your articles as fast as you put them out.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me.
You've been listening to Generation AI,
Automating Better Business,
a show from LivePerson.
Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. Please give us a rating, leave a comment, and share the episodes you love. Until next time.